The Yoruba people, who form a cultural and a linguistic or language group in Nigeria today, look back to two former high civilizations as ancestors. The first of these is Ife, and the second is Benin. We have on the screen right now two examples, pretty impressive examples, that come from the great kingdom of Ife. Ife is in my box at the very top of the slide, and in the second line you're going to see a pronunciation for it. It is pronounced Ife. We don't have specific dates, or let's say exact dates, but we have decent date ranges for Ife. There was a capital of Il-Ife, or just Ife, for this great kingdom, and at that capital there was an area of paved stones, and we think this might have been a place for ritual libations, for pouring essentially something through the stones. There were raised platforms at the end of this, probably altars, and it might have been on these altars that the heads that we're looking at here could indeed have been displayed. These probably being ancestors, probably divine and royal ancestors. Okay, the date range that we're looking at for the city, and I don't have this in my box, but we have archaeological evidence that people lived here as early as 500 BCE. The kingdom of Ife, which has various date ranges associated with it, will flourish between 1200 and 1400 CE, Common Era. In other words, kind of during the period of the Middle Ages in Europe. The art that comes from here is knock your socks off spectacular. It blends naturalism and idealism. It is most famous for its bronze work created with tin and copper. They also do make brass creations, that's copper and zinc. These images are incredibly impressive and were created using lost wax. Let's take a look at the one that O'Reilly is giving us. Oh, by the way, the left one is a king, an Oni. O-N-I, and the right one, which is a terracotta, is the head of a queen, and every inch the queen. Okay, this is the piece that you have in Mr. O'Reilly. What I'd like to point out is it's figure 1.1, and that means it's in the introduction of the book. So you're going to have to go to page 15 to find this. I'm going to recommend that you do that because O'Reilly's going to spend a lot of time talking about aesthetics in relationship to this particular head. This was found in a burial of what we think are a number of metal ritual objects, including other heads at the back of what looks like it was the palace. What we think we're looking at in this burial would be a bunch of objects that referred to royal qualities, insignia of the royals essentially, that could have been put together once a year for a festival of New Year's celebration or renewal for the king, or perhaps for the country, or perhaps for the city. All of that being associated with ancestor worship, which we think is probably fundamental to Ife and the use of these heads, as we'll see with Benin as well. The head has holes at the base, and that indicates that it could have been attached to something. So it could have been easily displayed, it could have been carried in a procession. It also has qualities that we can trace to modern Yoruba ideas of beauty, and among these would be the quality of being youthful. There is ideal naturalism, and part of the idealism here is the figure is shown in his prime. Before I leave this slide and get another view of this, I have two maps for you, and the lowest of the two will actually show you quite easily where the city of Ife is located in present-day Nigeria. Okay, maybe a little bit better view of the head that we also have in O'Reilly's book. There is a youthfulness, a commanding presence to this, a sense of composure that would be particularly important for conveying to the viewer ideas that are beautiful, both physically beautiful and spiritually beautiful. Take a look at O'Reilly, page 245. He gives you a full page of Yoruba aesthetics, what is believed to be beautiful today among the Yoruba people. Included in that would be what we've been calling the cool. And I'd like you to take a look at the face of this figure. It is cool, calm, collected. It is composed. And for the Yoruba and others in Africa, this would be a reference in particular for good character, for good behavior. In other words, outer beauty references inner beauty. The canons of beauty O'Reilly gives us for the Yoruba include symmetry and balance, clarity of form and line, kind of luminous quality, a delicacy, and when ornamentation is used, ornament that actually improves, enhances the beauty, and by doing so, I think tells us something about the rank and status of the individual. This piece also definitely reveals what O'Reilly links as Odo, which refers to the youthful quality of the piece, or as O'Reilly describes it, the prime of life. An individual who is essentially at his peak, and at the same time conveys the artistic qualities of perfection, but also the ideal qualities of good behavior. The Yoruba today do have art critics, and these art critics are referred to, named as people who know beauty, but that beauty refers to exterior beauty as well as inner control, moderation, good character, being upright and adding to your community. In other words, the sense of the cool, the quality of the cool that we've been talking about. This is also something we could refer to as ideal naturalism. And those of you who already know Greek art, Ife art shares that very much in common with the ancient Greeks. And it is for that reason we believe that when Europeans first find these Ife heads, which occurred in the colonial period, a period of colonial exploitation and control of the continent of Africa, they initially claimed that these heads were made by Greeks, by Greek colonists. Now, we do know that the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, did colonize. They just didn't colonize here. For the Europeans, however, it was very, very difficult to accept these as created by native people, indigenous people. So they claimed that these were made by outsiders, by the Greeks, in order to justify the colonial presence there. It becomes very difficult to justify controlling people and their resources if the past of these people is superior to your own. And in this case, it definitely would have been the objects that the Ife artists created in this period surpassed anything that was being done in Europe. The images do indeed reference moral purity, and this is something that's coming out of O'Reilly again, honor and virtue, and follow the Yoruba saying that character, good character, references beauty, and the two essentially are wedded together. Okay, before we leave this piece, I want you also to see the lines running with perfection down the face. We believe those are ethnic markings or scarification patterns. If you take a look at the neck, you're going to see rolls of fat being stylized into lines. Now, it's not that the individual being depicted was actually fat, but the individual is almost certainly elite and therefore wealthy and well-fed, and this is a symbolic way of referencing that. Okay, if you look at the face of our figure, also all of the features of the face, the lips, the nose, the eyes, the ears, are very carefully delineated and very highly naturalistic. There is a line along the top of the head, and there are a number of holes along that line where we do in fact believe that something was inserted. It could have been hair, it could have been a crown, or perhaps, as Mr. O'Reilly suggests, it could have been a veil. We aren't certain, but we do know that the image that we're looking at today would have almost certainly been used publicly, perhaps in movement, which we've gotten used to, carried in procession, for example, and would have been very richly adorned. This is a detail that O'Reilly includes, figure 712, and it is a 20th century, late 20th century Yoruba ruler who is wearing a beaded veil, along with carrying and using other regalia of a king, of essentially a divine right ruler. The beaded veil might be, can't prove it, might be what was attached over the face of the Ife leader, the Ife king that we just looked at. The reason for the beaded veil in Yoruba culture in the 20th century is because it was believed that the king was so powerful it was necessary to protect his subjects from his gaze, hence a veil to create a kind of protective division. As part of his regalia, and this continues to be universally used as symbolic references to political authority. There is a staff that he's holding. His feet are elevated on a stool, and it's difficult to see, but trust me, he is seated on a throne, which is a very strong reference to kingship, to power, and also in this case, perhaps to divine power. This is 711 in O'Reilly. It's a seated figure. It comes from a location called Tada. Tada is a village. It's about 120 miles from Ife. And this particular piece is really problematic because we can't explain it very well. It is incredibly naturalistic, and therefore we want to link it to Ife, but in certain ways it is not exactly like Ife. It is quite possible that it represents a slightly different, maybe contemporary tradition, and it is hoped that if that is the case, we find more of the art that comes from this time and place. It was found on the bank of the River Niger by a village. The people of the village were fishermen, and what they decided was that this object, which kind of magically and mystically appeared, had great power, and so what they did was wash it every week with the gravel from the Niger River. Why would they do that? Because they thought it would ensure the fertility of the fish in the river, and also therefore the welfare, the wealth, prosperity, and fertility for the village. Unfortunately, what that constant bathing of this object did was to abrade the surface of it. Nevertheless, there's enough detail left for us to see that it shares the naturalism of the region. That would be the naturalism of Ife, but as O'Reilly says, it really is the finest surviving piece that we can find from this region and linked to Yoruba history, essentially. It seems almost to be a portrait, and perhaps it is. It is a figure seated perhaps on what would be a stool or a low throne, so it's very tough to link this with an Ife king. And if you look at the head of the figure, the head is in proportion to the body, which we don't expect to find in depictions of rulers, of kings in particular. So it's not following the traditions that would be typically used. It is also a slightly different material. It is made out of almost pure copper, which Ife tended not to do. The relaxed pose of the figure, a kind of asymmetry to the pose, also isn't particularly consistent. So it's very, very difficult to define the origin or the meaning, the use for this particular figure. The best suggestion that I've heard is that it might have been an attendant to a king, and this figure might have been seated. Let's imagine a great tableau of cast figures associated with the presence of the king and the court of the king. Whatever it was originally used for, it is an absolutely stunning piece. Today, it is housed in the National Museum at Lagos, and this is what it looks like. This is a good scale shot, and you can see the reverence that is being given to this piece as it's being handled with white gloves. It is truly an extraordinary, an extraordinary object. Ife, we think, will be influential for the development of the culture that comes after it. It might be an origin for it, and that next culture will be the culture of Benin.